Over the last month or so, these lenses have actually got me thinking about the FX30 so much more. Now, this is the Sirui 40mm anamorphic lens, and you guys are seeing the 20mm anamorphic lens as well. They're 1.33 times, but they're autofocus for APS-C side sensors or Super 35 sensors like the FX30 you guys are seeing right now. And it's got me thinking a lot more about utilizing this camera, because I've had to utilize the camera to test these lenses in a lot of different situations. And because I shoot a lot of CrossFit and a lot of gym work, bodybuilding, that kind of stuff, in similar situations to the FX6, to the 874, to the Lumix S5 2X, the S1R2, all the cameras that I've been using, it really does actually look incredible and almost indistinguishable between the cameras. Like, the major differences you may actually see is probably just the depth of field differences. But even then, if I am pushing closer into the talent, the depth of field will obviously become a little bit more shallow. Or if I'm shooting with, you know, a wider open lens, then I will affect that depth of field. But, you know, there are those subtle differences between full frame and Super 35, but at the end of the day, it really is difficult to see the differences between the cameras. Now, I guess the biggest reason that I love using the FX30 is that you can use any Sony E-mount lens whatsoever. Now, I know you can do this the same with the full frame cameras in APS-C crop mode, but you don't have the kind of resolution that you do with this one. I mean, if you do have the A7R5 sensor, the A7CR, it's a really high resolution sensor. If you do put into Super 35 crop mode, it does tend to be a little bit better, but still, a native Super 35 camera allows you to use so many different lenses. The full frame G-Master lenses, they're super fast, but then you have just standard APS-C lenses like the Sirui lenses. They're super affordable. They can give you so much value, and you just have so much flexibility in what you're going to be using for your particular situation. And because it is Super 35, the lenses are generally smaller, and they're definitely a lot cheaper than their full frame counterparts as well. And look, there's a lot of us out there that don't want to be spending so much money, because some people are doing this as a hobby, some people are doing this, you know, as a side gig, and they don't want to be pouring thousands and thousands of dollars into high quality glass. Whereas with the Super 35 sensor, you have so much third-party options: Sigma, Tamron, Viltrox, Sirui. There's a whole bunch of different autofocus and manual focus counterparts that, you know, are so much cheaper than Sony native lenses. And I think overall, with the benefits of the FX30 is that you have it in that FX3 sort of builds. It's a brilliant build quality. I absolutely love it. And it's obviously different to the Alpha lineup because it's in the Cine lineup. So it is that sort of silver build. It's more of a boxy sort of shape. I just love the way that it's designed, because it's more purposely built for videographers rather than photographers or hybrid shooters. Now, rigging options is a major plus for the FX30, because you can rig it up or you can actually rig it down as well. You can just utilize the body itself because it has that flip screen, and it also has that top handle that you can buy with it as well, which has the XLR inputs. So you can have really nice flexibility with a really small build or a larger build. It really depends on the workflow and what you're actually doing with the camera, what you're actually, you know, hooking into it and adapting to it. So if you have a monitor, if you have video transmitters, this is where, you know, building it out and having a V-mount battery and powering all those options to it would be perfect. Even if you have some rails and manual focus lenses, then you can put your follow focus system on there as well, or just your autofocus lens, like I said, just a very small body. So it just gives you so many different ways to rig it out. And if you have it on car rigs or gimbal rigs, you can just have it so small or build it right out. And that's one of the things that actually sucks about my Sony FX6 is that it's a fantastic camera, but you can only get it so small because it's essentially a box camera, and once you put the top handle on it and battery, it kind of makes it quite big, even with the side handle. If you take them all off, it is still relatively big. Sure, you can put it on a gimbal, but this is where the FX3, FX30 just has a really nice form factor. Now, another pro with the FX30 happens to come down to that fast and reliable autofocus system, and this is pretty much well known with Sony cameras, especially the newer Sony cameras. The FX30 doesn't have that AI chip in it that you will see in the ZV-E10 Mark II in the APS-C models, but still it has brilliant autofocus. And I mean, it's very similar to the FX30 and the A7 IV, where it doesn't have that newer autofocus system. But in the future, when we do see an FX30 Mark II, you know, further on down the line, it most likely will have that AI chip in there, which will obviously enhance that autofocus capabilities. But in majority of the situations I've been putting in, it's perfectly fine. Obviously, it depends on the lenses you're actually using with it as well. But I use a lot of third-party lenses, and they've worked perfectly fine for me. You know, touch to focus is great. Sometimes it is hit and miss depending on the contrast ratios and if it's really backlit and dark situations. But I mean, that's a very difficult situation. But in my opinion, Sony are leading the autofocus chart. Like, they have the best cameras when it comes to autofocus systems and reliability. Another big one that I have noticed with some of the other cameras is overheating. Now, the Sony FX3 and FX30 have an inbuilt fan, so you've got that active cooling. So if you are using it in long record times, long record sessions, podcasts, weddings, interviews, this is going to be an extremely valuable feature because you're going to be keeping your camera cool, and obviously it's not going to be shutting down on you, and that is massive. If there is a camera that sort of shuts down on you and it's completely unusable, then that really is bad. And because these are professional tools that you need them to work in these kind of situations, and if it completely shuts down, that's not great. And I have noticed that with the new Lumix S1R2, like that one was shutting down on me in some situations, and overheating was an issue in a few different modes, and we just don't want that. And we did see that with the Sony ZV-E1 because it's such a small camera, it just overheats after a while if you're doing really long Zoom calls, interviews, web live streamings and all those kind of things. Yeah, it just does suck. The Sony FX30 also is obviously part of the Sony Cine line, so it is videography first, which it does incredibly well. But in saying that, it does still take stills, which is great because if you do want to use it as just a thumbnail shooter or just a travel camera that you do want to take 1 or 2 stills, that's perfectly fine. But the key differences between obviously this video camera and a photography camera is that you don't have any burst rates with this. You can only take single shot stills, but it's still fine, but it is electronic shutter as well. So there may be some rolling shutter artifacts in terms of banding with LED lights, but you know, this is where you just need to adjust your shutter speed to be able to counteract the banding issues. And look, I do have to mention that this camera isn't perfect. There isn't really a perfect camera because there are so many different situations where people are going to be utilizing these cameras in that would suit a particular camera. Like, one camera just doesn't really do absolutely everything. I know the FX30 is a pretty incredible camera that suits a lot of different situations, but even that camera has a few weaknesses. You know, if you are filming with anamorphic lenses, it doesn't have open gate recording, and neither does this. Like, the only thing that we have as Sony shooters when it comes to anamorphics is just the in-camera D-squeeze in the FX3, the FX30, and the FX6, and that doesn't even give us anything when it comes to anamorphic stabilization within those cameras. But unfortunately, if you do put it into that D-squeeze mode, the 1.3 or 2 times, you do actually lose autofocus, but you also use the image stabilization as well, which is kind of weird. Sony do need to update this. This would be great, but that is a little bit of a con if you're using the new anamorphic autofocus lenses. But a lot of situations that I've been putting it in, small commercials, social media content, private businesses and corporate stuff, it works incredible, especially if you do have that XLR input on the top. You have that shotgun microphone on the top. You've got, you know, professional XLR inputs as well. There's so much to like about this camera. But I guess one of the major downsides that I did actually point out when this camera was actually released was the 4K 120 frames per second. It's pretty noisy, and it obviously crops in on that sensor to give you better readout on that sensor. And unfortunately, when cropping in on the sensor, it does enhance the noise that actually is displayed on your screen. So it can become a little bit noisy. Even if you do overexpose or expose correctly, you still will see a lot more noise than you would with the regular 4K 30 or 4K 60. Now, I can see this from run and gun shooters' point of view that, you know, if you're doing weddings or event videography with low light situations, this is obviously when the A7S III or the FX3 will come into the advantages because of that second base of 12,800. This second base is only 2,500, so it's a quite low second base, but the noise performance doesn't necessarily clean up as not even close to where the A7S III or FX3 does. And those cameras are probably better in those kind of situations with the run and gun because you just have a little bit more flexibility in the power of that sensor and the amount of light that you can gather into the sensor. Now, there's one feature that is actually rising in popularity, and that comes down to OpenGate. And unfortunately, Sony cameras don't have OpenGate in their consumer cameras. They do have it on their higher-end professional camera like the Sony Venice. But we don't know if it's going to be leaking down into these APS-C size cameras. Like, a lot of people are really loving, especially myself, loving the OpenGate recording in the Lumix cameras. Even Fuji cameras have their APS-C cameras that have OpenGate. It's really going to be interesting in future firmware updates or future camera models to see if Sony will actually offer OpenGate recording. And look, if you don't know what OpenGate recording, essentially it just allows you to record the whole sensor. So we generally have a 3x2 shaped sensor, and we can only record 16:9 portion or 17:9 portion of that sensor. And hopefully you'll be able to record 3x2, which gives you more vertical resolution, which allows for cropping in with vertical content, but it also allows a lot of people to use anamorphic lenses and make the most of the anamorphic de-squeezing, because you don't actually have to chop off too much more off the sides if you have higher vertical resolution when you put it into your timeline. But it really depends on what kind of timeline you're putting it into as well. If you're putting it straight into a 2.35:1, 2.4:1, it's going to be fine. But if you put it into a 16:9 timeline, you will still have to chop some off the sides. But look, a lot of the anamorphic videos I've actually done, I do explain that further, so definitely go check those out if it's a little bit confusing. But look, in terms of 2025, this camera is absolutely phenomenal. It pretty much isn't a job you can't use this on, but there are some of those workarounds with some of the cons that does come with this camera, but it really doesn't have too many cons at the end of the day. So thanks for watching, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.